On paper, zero attack minions should just be about the worst minions in the game since they can't attack or deal any damage back when they're attacked. And while they are seemingly useless, all of the entries on this list have effects that make them good enough to see competitive play. And at number 10, we have Mana Tide Totem. This is a 3-mana 0/3 totem for shamans that lets you draw a card at the end of each of your turns. This card is a pretty good example of what to expect on this list, since its only use is as, essentially, a repeatable spell effect as long as it's on the board. Mana Tide has long been a staple of the shaman class since it's only one of a few card draw options available for it. And barring Ancestral Knowledge, which has always been a mediocre card at best, if you wanted to draw more cards as a shaman, you just pretty much had to run it. The idea behind this card is that once you play it and end your turn, it immediately draws you a card and has the possibility of drawing you an infinite amount of cards as long as it stays alive. But with only 3 health, which is comparable to a lot of 2-drops, and no attack to defend itself, it was dead easy to kill it if your opponent had developed any sort of board beforehand. It also didn't even pay off unless you kept it alive for at least another turn, since at 3 mana you had to draw at least 2 cards for it to even be comparable to an Arcane Intellect. But despite all these drawbacks, the need for card draw was so bad that most decks put up with it, where it found itself in some of the best decks in the early days of Hearthstone. Unlike other classes, Shaman did have access to some of the best control tools and totem synergy cards in the game, meaning it was very possible to protect and buff it for enough turns in a row for it to completely snowball a game into a win. Unfortunately though, like most of the cards from the classic set, enough cards have been printed in the game to the point where card draw is no longer an issue for Shaman, and with that, Mana Tide Totem fell into obscurity. But because of how much it was played and used well into the game's lifespan, it definitely deserves to be placed in the number 10 spot on this list. And speaking of Shaman cards, and at number 9 we have Spirit of the Frog. This is a 3-mana 0/3 Shaman minion which gives itself stealth for 1 turn, making it untargetable to enemy spells and minions, and has the effect where whenever you cast a spell, this card lets you draw another spell from your deck that costs 1 more mana than the one you just casted. Spirit of the Frog was the definition of a combo enabler, and was just straight up a better version of Mana Tide Totem in basically every Shaman deck. For one, it basically had built-in protection the turn it was played, meaning if you played it on turn 3, you didn't have to worry about it being targeted and dying for free, unlike Mana Tide Totem. And on the following turn, if your deck was set up for it, you can go into crazy chains, ideally starting with a 0-cost spell, playing the 1-cost spell you drew off of Spirit, and basically playing through your entire deck. This strategy was so good that it basically pushed Frog Shaman to be one of the best decks in Standard, and as the new main draw engine in most wild decks for some time. But where Spirit of the Frog really shined was in Burn Shaman, which tried to burst down your opponent from full using all of the amazing direct damage spells Shamans had access to. For example, if you happen to have Lightning Bloom in hand, which gave you 2 free mana for the turn, you could then Lightning Bolt your opponent, then Crackle them, Lava Burst them, and Overdraft them, dealing up to 20 damage. And since Overdraft would let you draw another 2-cost spell and got rid of your Overload, you were free to continue the chain, if your opponent wasn't already dead yet. And through the combination of other 2 spells to continue the chain, and Diligent Note Taker to copy your important burst spells, it basically made most other forms of spell draw on Shaman obsolete. But because Spirit of the Frog decks are so reliant on drawing it to actually function, most players have opted not to use it because of how inconsistent those decks are. That said, Spirit of the Frog definitely deserves to be on this list for its status as the best draw engine Shaman has to offer, as well as its inclusion in various Tier 1 and Tier 2 decks over the years. And at number 8, we have Boneweb Egg. This 2-mana 0/2 Warlock minion summons 2 2/1 beasts when it dies, or summons them when Boneweb Egg gets discarded. And despite what you might think, discard effects in Hearthstone are nowhere near as broken as you might think they are. Unlike in other card games, all discard effects are random, which means you can't pick which cards get RNG'd into the void. They also don't trigger if you happen to burn them from your deck, so cards like Altar of Fire have no synergy. Despite their limitations though, Discard Warlock has actually been quite a good deck in the past. You see, just like any archetype, once a critical mass of good synergy cards become available, basically any archetype can become viable. And when you know it, Boneweb Egg, along with a new package of discard cards, actually pushed Discard Warlock to have one of the most insane early high rolls ever. Before Boneweb Egg, one of the main problems with discard decks is that even though they have a ton of cards they can discard, and cards that you want to discard, they didn't have a lot of cards that actually wanted to discard. But with the New Age discard package, which included Hand of Gul'dan, which could potentially draw you 3 cards for free, and Boneweb Egg, which was the only other card that could summon itself when being discarded, suddenly Discard Warlock became one of the few good mid-range decks in Wild. These 2 cards helped immensely in shoring up Discard Warlock's problem of board control and draw, to the point where it actually had an unstoppable early game and refuel potential, even by Wild standards. And when paired with Wicked Whispers, which discards your lowest cost card, you could give all of your minions +1/+1 while also summoning 2 3/2 spiders with it. Unfortunately, as good as the potential high rolls were in the deck, the real carry of the deck was the Merchant to Hand combo, which was a cool 2-mana draw 3 that would absolutely win most matchups on the spot. But because Boneweb Egg's use was limited to pure discard decks, it can only make it to number 8 spot on this list. And at number 7, we have Doomsayer. This rather unique 2-mana 0/7 neutral minion has the effect where it destroys all minions on the field, including itself, if it manages to survive until the start of your next turn. This card holds a special place in many long-term veterans' hearts since Doomsayer was the card that every control deck wanted to have in their opening hand, and worked almost too well against aggro decks. In an ideal world, your opponent would play their 1-drop, you would pass, they would play their 2-drop, and you would play Doomsayer. And since almost no aggro decks back in the day had enough damage to kill the massive 7th health Doomsayer by turn 3, even if it dealt 0 damage back, they'd be forced to waste their turn 3 doing nothing, all while watching their crucial early game board get blown up by Doomslayer. This play alone was usually enough to single-handedly win the match for control decks, since without their early board or tempo to snowball off of, most aggro decks would quickly run out of steam and get crushed by more efficient removal. These early turns were, and still are, so crucial to most aggro decks that it wasn't even a bad play for some control decks to coin out their Doomslayer in turn 1, just so they could preemptively stop their opponent from building up a board. And even when an aggro deck spent their turn 3 using a direct damage spell to help clear a Doomsayer, they'd still be going 1 for 1 and wasting a ton of damage that they could have been using to hit you. Doomsayer was also a very solid card in control versus control matchups during the early days of Hearthstone. Against an opposing Sylvanas, you could play a Doomsayer against her, remove her in some way, which would steal your Doomsayer, pass, and have them blow up their own board at the start of their turn. Or it could even be played behind a friendly taunt minion as a threat to potentially clear your opponent's massive board if left unchecked. Unfortunately, since then, every single class in the game has gotten more surefire, cheap control tools to slow down aggro decks a ton. And I'm sure if the game were as slow as it was a couple of years ago, Doomsayer would still see a ton of play. But with the rise of aggro decks that can easily deal 7 damage on turn 3, and combo decks that don't even want to contest the board, a lot of old school control decks have basically seen no play at all. Unfortunately, aggro decks have become too fast for Doomslayer to deal with, which is why he's only the number 7 spot on this list. And speaking of classic cards, at number 6 we have Summoning Portal. This 4-mana 0/4 Warlock minion makes all of your minions cost 2 mana less, but with a minimum cost of 1 mana. At first glance, this card seems pretty awful considering it's just a more expensive and restrictive version of Sorcerer's Apprentice, but for minions. I mean, just to break even on mana, you'd have to play 2 other minions, and only if they cost 3 or more mana. And I'll admit, this is a pretty weird placement for this card, especially considering that Summoning Portal has been a horrendous card for 99% of its time being printed. But during that other 1% of the time, it has enabled degenerate combo decks so good that it actually forced Blizzard to change one of the core mechanics of the game just to nerf it. So what happened? Well, it all started right before the Boomsday Project expansion was launched, where every player who logged in was given a free copy of Snip Snap. This neutral 3-mana 2/3 legendary mech has the effect where you can fuse it to another mech, you can play 2 repeatable temporary copies of it until the end of your turn, and it summons 2 1/1 mechs after it dies. And if you haven't spotted the combo yet, don't worry, because neither did Blizzard. Because if you manage to have Summoning Portal and Mech Warper on the board, which makes all your mechs cost 1 less mana, it makes all of your copies of Snip Snap cost 0 mana, meaning you can essentially play an infinite amount of stats in 1 turn by magnetizing them to each other. To this day, I'm still not entirely sure how the interaction worked, considering the text of the Summoning Portal doesn't allow for 0-cost minions, but I think it's because Mech Warper doesn't have the extra limitation. In any case, this deck had the potential to kill you by turn 4 if you drew the nuts, and since all the combo pieces were either free or dirt cheap to craft, the early days of the Boomsday expansion were completely awful to play during, since every game was just who could assemble the infinite Snip Snap combo the fastest. Since then, Blizzard has changed the actual Echo mechanic so that every generated Echo copy has to cost at least 1 mana, even if it could cost less. But because Summoning Portal did enable an arguably S-tier deck to exist, I've placed it just outside of the top 5 since it did suck in every other scenario. And at number 5, we have Nerubian Egg. This neutral 2-mana 0/2 simply summons a vanilla 4/4 minion when it dies. This card, despite not being able to attack on its own, was actually crazy good for a long time in a lot of aggro decks as a solid turn 2 play. And while it is useless on its own, you've got 28 other cards in your deck that can help bring out its true potential. Nerubian Egg was actually the first egg card Blizzard ever printed, with a ton of spin-offs being printed because of how much fans love the card. It's basically an overstatted 3-drop at the cost of a 2-drop, but it's stuck inside an egg that can't break itself, which was a pretty creative idea at the time and taught players about how zero-attack minions work. Over the years though, players have gotten really creative with trying to get the maximum value out of it, either by forcing opponents to attack into it, buffing its attack to pop itself, triggering its death rattle a bunch of times in spells, or forcing it to die. When it first came out, it was a staple in every Zoo Warlock deck, which tried to overwhelm their opponent with a ton of cheap minions, and did more than you'd think for a zero-attack minion. For one, it offered board clear protection. If an egg was on the board and your opponent played a spell that dealt 2 or more damage to all of your minions, they'd have to deal with a 4/4 Nerubian afterwards. Or if you buffed its attack somehow and killed another minion with it, you'd actually be gaining a massive tempo and mana advantage off of it. And a respectable 4/4, the Nerubian it spawned also diversified an otherwise swarmy zoo deck, and usually required your opponent to play some sort of single target removal to get rid of it. Years later, Token Druid, another tier 1 deck, picked this card up because of its sheer utility, and made more use of it using the insanely efficient Mark of the Lotus to make it a permanent threat. And even though it doesn't have any notable tribal synergy, the fact that it stuck around for so long after being printed in the first expansion really speaks to how well it was designed, which is why it's placed here at number 5. And at number 4, we have Flame Tongue Totem. This 2-mana 0/3 Shaman Totem gives adjacent minions +2 attack while it's on the board. Flame Tongue has been in the game ever since release and has seen on and off play at the highest level the entire time. In the early days of the game, it saw a lot of play as one of the best aggro tools in the game. Although it may seem incapable of doing much damage because it buffs your minion by +4 attack, it can rack up a ton of damage in just a couple of turns. Pair that with the Shaman hero power that summons minions for you to buff with it, and some of the most unstoppable early game threats early Hearthstone has ever seen, and you were almost always guaranteed to get maximum value off of it. And because Flame Tongue gives the attack boost to adjacent minions immediately, it's effectively a 2-mana 4 attack minion that lets you attack immediately, meaning you can easily dominate board control against other tempo decks, or punish control decks for being too slow. Later on, when Baku and Gen were printed, Shaman became even better at swarming the board with totems, since Gen made your hero power cost 1 mana if you only included even cost minions, and because Flame Tongue Totem costs 2 mana, it saw staple play in this tier 1 deck and made all of the seemingly harmless totems your hero power summoned into immediate threats. And because Flame Tongue Totem's effect was tied to an aura effect, if your opponent happened to kill an adjacent minion, a new one would slide in where the other one died and would also get buffed. This mechanic of Flame Tongue has been so influential in fact, that it's also one of the main reasons why most players and pros still take a second or two to consider their minions' board positioning, just because Flame Tongue Totem and other similar cards have been so prevalent at one point. Even now, despite getting hit with 2 nerfs, Flame Tongue Totem is still on the rise, with both Standard and Wild getting their own share of competitive Totem synergy cards, and while even Shaman is currently a low tier 2 deck in Wild, its complete dominance for years in Wild definitely earns it a top 4. And at number 3, we have Runic Egg. This neutral 1-mana 0/2 simply lets you draw a card when it dies. If you've seen our last couple of videos, you know that we love 1-mana draw 1 effects, and Runic Egg definitely fits that category. The only problem is Runic Egg is about 100 times harder to use and get value off than just about every other cheap cycle card out there. So why is it in the top 3 on this list? Well, if you asked me this a couple years ago, I'd probably wonder that too. But since then, there have been a ton of changes to the meta that have made it worth running. For one, since the release of Runic Egg almost 6 years ago, Warlock has become the de facto control king in Hearthstone, with some of the most greedy, slow, and dominant decks owing their success to the amazing control spells the class has to offer. And while I won't list every great control tool Warlock has to offer, some of the best ones have amazing synergy with the egg. Defile, a classic Warlock staple, is a 2-mana spell that deals 1 damage to all minions and repeats it if it kills one. Has immediate synergy with the egg as both a way to pop it and has 2 health minion to continue the Defile chain. Plague of Flames, another great spell, at just 1 mana destroys all of your minions and destroys a random enemy minion for each one, pairs amazingly well with egg, since it lets you destroy an extra enemy minion basically for free. This new age control package was especially good in Mechathune Warlock decks, which tried to empty their hand, deck, and battlefield as quickly as possible so they could trigger Mechathune's Death Rattle effect to instantly win the game. And while you may be skeptical about how good a literally dead card was, Mechathune Warlock has been a tier 1 deck in Wild multiple times owing to the extra draw the egg provides. It's also one of the cheapest card draw options out there that can be nuked by Hemet Jungle Hunter, which greatly helped the deck's consistency and speed at which it gets to its Mechathune combo. And while Runic Egg has mostly fallen out of favor, its crucial ability to cycle through some of the best decks in Wild has not gone unnoticed. And at number 2, we have Naval Mine. This neutral 2-mana 0/2 mech deals 4 damage to your opponent when it dies, which is very in flavor of what you'd expect a mine to do. What isn't expected though is how good this card is for what effectively is a pack filler. Somehow, through the power of synergy and scammy rogue cards, Wild players immediately abuse this card in one of the most unstoppable combo decks of all time. And while the actual combo doesn't actually deal 30 damage, its surprisingly good early game and intractable combo made it quite the force to deal with. Naval Mine didn't have it all great though, and was thought of as a pure meme deck for quite a while. After all, you'd probably expect some sort of big, complicated mess of a strategy to work, instead of random mine triggering a bunch of times and killing you. But the only reason why this deck was even able to exist was because out of every minion out there, Naval Mine has the single best ratio of direct damage to cost in the game. And with all the ways Rogues has to accumulate to trigger death rattles in a single turn, it's no wonder Mine Rogue became a top combo deck in Wild for a time. So what you do to set up the combo beforehand was first play Snowfall Graveyard, a spell which made all your death rattle triggers twice for 3 turns. Necrium Blade, a weapon which triggered a death rattle when it broke, and set it to 1 durability. Then on the combo turn, you'd play Sketchy Information, which would also trigger a Mine's death rattle, Naval Mine, break the Necrium Blade, and deal around 27 damage. But because this combo doesn't really use any floodgate-prone cards, like a ton of Battlecry minions or spells, Mine Rogue, as it's called, is a surprisingly resilient combo deck. Unfortunately, despite being a key card in a very good wild deck, I can only place Naval Mine in number 2 spot on this list because of Prince Renathal. This card lets decks that play him start the game with 40 cards and 40 health, which effectively puts any decks that run him out of range of Naval Mine, and makes the matchup pretty much impossible to win. But unlike Naval Mine, the next card on this list has no problems dealing with Renathal decks. And at number 1, we have Spirit of the Shark. This 4-mana 0/3 rogue minion, like Spirit of the Frog, makes itself untargetable by enemy attacks and spells for 1 turn, and also doubles the effects of all battle cries and combo minions you play. And for those of you who don't know, the Battlecry keyword triggers when you play the card from your hand, and the combo keyword is just like a Battlecry, except you need to have played at least 1 other card during your turn beforehand for the effect to trigger. As you'd probably guessed by now, this card is every combo player's dream card, and has accordingly enabled some of the most degenerate, unfair, and crazy combo decks of all time. Well, in Wild that is. In Standard, there were no good combo win conditions that really need you to double your minions' effects to work, and was only really played as a way to make your giant Edwin combos even bigger. Wild players, on the other hand, had access to all of the most disgusting combo enablers of the past and present, and eventually created Pillager Rogue, which tried to play as many cards in 1 turn as possible to deal that amount of damage to their opponent's face using their namesake card. This was the single best combo deck to beat in the format for a while, and no deck, no matter how aggressive or tanky, could ever truly get out of range of its 1-turn combo kill. You see, after setting up Spirit of the Shark on turn 4, this deck could easily OTK your opponent on turn 5, since pretty much every card in the deck had a Battlecry or combo effect that could generate more cards, reduce the cost of those cards, or let you replay those cards over and over again. Its reign as the single best deck in Wild didn't last for long though, since every other deck started running cards that either disrupt or outpace the inevitable Pillager Rogue combo. Despite Renathal killing basically every other OTK deck out there, Pillager Rogue is still a top threat in Wild, with its only weakness being its insanely high skill ceiling. With such a large number of cards required to play during the combo turn, it's almost inevitable that most players, including pros, will miss out on some damage or be unable to play their hand before their turn timer runs out. And when the only limitation to your deck is how good of a player you are, I'd say it's hardly a drawback. And because Spirit of the Shark helped enable Pillager Rogue to become one of the most recent Tier 1 decks in Wild, and still sees competitive play to this day, it has to be named the best zero attack minion in the game. Alright, and that's the list. If you think we missed any other card that should have been on this list, or have ideas for future videos just like this one, let us know down in the comments.